Welcome to episode 34 of the Trainer's Bullpen, How We Learn to Move, Part 3, with Dr. Rob Gray. Rob Gray is a psychology professor and research psychologist with a focus on perceptual motor control in driving, aviation, and sport. He also hosts the Perception Action podcast and is the author of two best-selling books on the acquisition of movement skills, How We Learn to Move, and Learning to Optimize Movement. Rob serves as the skill acquisition specialist for the Boston Red Sox. In this interview, Dr. Gray discusses the key aspects from chapters 5 and 6 from his book, How We Learn to Move. Rob provides insights on how coaches and trainers can embrace a motor learning environment that is nonlinear and a self-organizational model of movement. Also mentioned is how the perception of the world is embodied and how affordances shape the way we perceive opportunities for action. Dr. Gray introduces the important concept of invariance and why it matters in performance and coaching. Additional topics covered in this interview are embodied perception, Gibson's affordances and his theory in conflict with traditionalist views, body and action capacity scaling, the importance of variability, intrinsic dynamics and how they relate to movement variability, and how the law of attraction relates to movement variability and invariance. This interview contains practical insights on how trainers should embrace the ecological nonlinear self-organizational model of instruction and modify constraints to cause learners to self-organize movements and understand the application of affordances and the laws of attraction to design effective training environments. Well, welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen, where trainers in the law enforcement space come to hear experts talk about their work, experience, and research into human performance, particularly as it relates to the critical aspects of training motor learning and decision-making. The purpose of the Trainer's Bullpen is to help bridge the gap between law enforcement training and the findings of academic research and current pedagogical best practices. Our desire at the Trainer's Bullpen is to help advance law enforcement training, to make research applied, and improve officer and public safety. The Trainer's Bullpen is a production of Raptor Protection, and I'm Chris Butler, your host. Dr. Gray, welcome back to the Trainer's Bullpen, and thanks for making the time today.
Thanks, Chris. My pleasure.
So we've been working on a bit of a series here as we've been moving methodically through your book, How We Learn to Move, a revolution in the way we coach and practice sports skill. And so just as a bit of a background, Rob, I'll just give a brief overview for our listeners of where we've gone through in the first series of interviews. So in the last episode, we discussed the fact that we are self-organizing beings living in a rich ecological world. And as a result of that, you presented what I would say is a very compelling argument for training and coaching methods that embrace a motor learning environment that is nonlinear, self-organizational model of movement. And as a result of that, coaches and trainers need to break away from what we referred to as a traditionalist linear or repetition-based and technique-focused model of instruction. We also discussed the application of constraints in the nonlinear ecological approach and how coaches and trainers can modify these three constraints that you told us about, the task, the environment, and the performer, in order to cause the learner to self-organize their own movements that are desirable for achieving successful outcomes. So, Rob, with that as a background, let's move on to looking at chapters 5 and 6 in your book today. So, Rob, you titled chapter 5, We Perceive the World in Terms of What Our Body affords us. So that word affords is an important one. And in fact, as I understand it, the more I read through your book and the more I read about the ecological dynamic approach to coaching, affordances are one of the critical concepts of this whole self-organizational model that you told us about last time. So I know we're going to spend a lot of time talking about affordances. So can you just maybe prime us for that by telling us about affordances? What are they, and why should coaches and trainers care?
Yeah, so the idea of affordance, it comes from James Gibson, is one of his fundamental ideas. It's the idea that what we actually perceive in the world is not, we don't perceive inches and miles per hour and, things in units of physics like we're taught in kind of class. And what we perceive are opportunities for action, because that's what we're doing, right? We're moving around the world doing different things. So when I look at my desk, I don't perceive that it's 2 feet wide, 3 feet long. I perceive it offers like a place to do work. But at the same time, it also offers sitting on, right? Things aren't, affordances are not always based on what things were designed for. They're opportunities for action that are kind of invited by our environment, and that I like to think of them as invitations, because we can take them if we want, right? I could sit on my desk if I want. I don't have to, though. But critically, they also depend on our own constraints, or those performer constraints you just mentioned, right? If I'm not tall enough, then my desk doesn't afford sitability. A basketball hoop does not afford dunking for me. I'm not tall enough. But it affords dunking for other people. But so that's the fundamental idea, that we're going around kind of getting invited for doing these different activities, different options for action.
Okay, and so Dr. Gray, you mentioned Gibson. And so can you tell us a little bit more about Gibson? Because like, what was his work in this area? How did he even come up with this idea of affordances? And as I understand it in my reading, Gibson was a little bit of a radical when it came to the traditionalist view of how we learn to move. And so maybe tell us a little bit more about him.
Yeah, so Gibson was an academic, but he ended up, a lot of his work was at Cornell, when they knew that closer to the end of his career. But in a funny way, he kind of paralyzed Bernstein, because he really got involved in applied things. He would not just in a lab in a university. He got asked to help out with the Air Force, understanding pilots, and a bunch of other things. But yeah, Gibson came up with the fundamental idea of direct perception, the idea that we don't the kind of traditional idea, and the idea that a lot of people still subscribe to, is that our brain is like a computer, right? We're processing things, interpreting things. You often hear reality is a construction or an illusion that our brain makes up. Gibson didn't buy that at all, right? He believed that we don't need to compute things or process things. We just pick up these things from the environment. The environment is rich with information that we can use to control our actions. If we just pick that information up, we don't need to do all this extra work. So he really turned perception on its head by saying, there's information out in the environment, rather than focusing on just what's going on in our head.
Okay, and he termed that himself, like his own hypothesis. Gibson referred to that as a radical hypothesis. Did he say that because of that very reason? Like, what he was proposing was so contrary to the accepted traditionalist view, and I want to say at the time, but really the traditionalist view is still very much the traditionalist view, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. No, I think it's definitely fair, to call it radical. Yeah, it totally changes kind of the job of perception. Even kind of the analogy, and it's more of we're more of a receiver of information rather than a computer. So yeah, I think it's fair. That's a fair term you use, for sure.
And we're not just talking about nuances here in hypotheses, because whichever perspective a coach or a trainer subscribes to. So if I subscribe to the traditionalist view that my brain is just a supercomputer, the world is valueless and meaning, and I just apply my own, I have programs that just download in relation to what's happening, that then impacts everything about how I coach and how I train, versus if I take more the ecological, dynamical Gibson view of it, then I have a radically different approach to how I coach and train. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I think so. I think, it definitely changes what we want to expose the athlete to, what kind of experiences we want to give them, for sure. The idea that it really, the end of my podcast, I always use the expression "keep them coupled," which is Gibson's. What comes after from Gibson, the idea that we get information from our environment. We can't kind of separate the two, the actor from the environment.
Right. And so an application of this would be, Rob, if I observe, say, a law enforcement officer who's trying to arrest an individual who suddenly becomes combative and resistive, if that officer has been trained under a paradigm of, a very linear technique-based traditionalist view, what we often will see is a failure to be able to pick up on what you have referred to as the affordances in that resistance, to look for, now, how can they quickly adapt and look for those opportunities for actions, because a linear training approach does not translate into a really ambiguous ecological world, does it?
Yeah, I think that's, one of the consequences. Definitely, we kind of we'll think, the idea that you just learn a set of rules. If this happens, then I do that, versus picking up what's actually happening in the moment. I think you definitely, I think people would say that would be the case.
Excellent. So, Rob, I'm just going to read a brief selection from your book here on page 62. You wrote this. You say, the perception of the world is changing depending on our ability to act on it. When an athlete is more capable and performing well, objects like a baseball, tennis ball, or a basketball hoop look bigger. When they are struggling, they look smaller. How is this possible if our perceptual system is trying to accurately represent the physical layout of our environment and the environment is not changing? The answer is that perception of our environment is not solely based on its physical properties. Instead, perception is embodied. You say perception is embodied. So, what do you mean by that, embodied perception?
So the basic idea is that we're not just kind of perceiving objects in abstract their qualities. We're perceiving it relative to our own capabilities. So, there's been some great work by a person named Jesse Witt who's done this. So if I give you a really small bat, right, a baseball bat, imagine, and I throw a ball that's kind of 6 inches from your body, right, that's not very hittable, right? You can't reach it with a small bat. If I give you a longer bat, right, then you suddenly can get to it, right? It's hittable. What we find is in what people actually perceive as the ball looks bigger in the second case, because even though it's the same physical size, it's still however, whatever many inches diameter. It hasn't changed at all. But what has changed is your capacity, because I've given you this long, your body capacity. And the reason it looks bigger in the second case is we don't perceive inches or diameters or things. We perceive hittability. That's the affordance. Like, going back to it, when the ball is hittable, we perceive what person is telling you is that it's hittable because you gave them a longer bat. So we perceive the world not just in terms of its physical layout, in terms of sizes and distance. We perceive it relative to what we're capable as well. So embodied means within our, relative to our body.
Okay, and so for, say, a law enforcement officer, if they're in a combative situation, would then that embodied perception also relate to their perceived ability to respond to? So, and every officer would be different based on their own embodied perception of how they feel that they're capable of responding. Or in an officer involved shooting, one officer might feel an entirely different opportunity for action versus another officer. Would that be an application of embodied perception in that?
For sure. Yeah. So I guess, relative to, a person, whether you can take them down or subdue them or restrain them, your perception of whether that's afforded, it depends on your physical size, your training, right? The environment, whether there's just one person there, right? So what you're perceiving is this opportunity. Can I actually restrain this person or not? Maybe if you can't, then you call for backup, right? Or something, you just keep them. But so yeah, that's the idea. You're not just perceiving they're 6 feet to 300 pounds. You're perceiving what can I do here? What actions are invited to me from this environmental situation, which is going to strongly depend on both your kind of physical dimensions, your body, how much you weigh, but also on your capabilities, your training, your skills, right? For sure.
And Rob, does that embodied perception, I mean, it must be variable, because I'm imagining, say, an officer who is sporting some type of a minor injury, or maybe has been attended court all day and has had no sleep, or has maybe got some illness, like or even just their whole mental state that day. Does that embodied perception, does it change those capabilities?
Yeah, for sure. It kind of recalibrates as we go. I talk about this example in my book, this wonderful study that Karen Adolph did of pregnant women. They were asking them, can you pass through this gap sideways? And the answer changed systematically through the months of pregnancy, which exactly matched their stomach size. As their stomach got bigger, they started to see gaps that weren't passable anymore. And so, yeah, we go through this all the time. The kind of relationship between our abilities is changing, and the environment is changing. You get, like, I always think of this too, when you rent a car, you get a car with a different braking qualities, right? You suddenly see the world as, can I pass that of the car? Nope. not with this one, right? Not my capabilities have changed. Yes, so it's totally a dynamic process, and the environment, these opportunities are opening and closing, right, all the time as well too. Maybe my opportunity, I had to restrain that person, was there a moment ago, but then it disappears, right, based on what's happening in the environment. So yeah, it's all dynamic situation.
And is that what you mean when you said, in your book, you said that our perceptions of our capability change the way we perceive what is, and you said out there. And so are you talking about that interrelationship between my own embodied perception and how I assess the value of what is happening out in my environment?
Exactly. Yeah. No, you're right. An injury, if I get hurt my knee or something, a big set of stairs I'm not going to perceive that as climbable anymore, right? I'm going to go find an escalator or an elevator. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So, I've often heard the quote, and I believe it was Anas Nin who first said this, that we don't see the world the way it is, we see the world the way we are. And so is that kind of the thing you're getting at here, that most of us, what we perceive in the world comes from really our own internal, our, what do you call it, our heuristics, our perceptions of our own capabilities, our own inabilities, and they color
yeah, it's related to that for sure. Yeah, you're related to what your constraints and your capacities for sure.
Okay, and it's so why is this view necessary of embodied perception? Like, why would we need to perceive the world in this embodied way for performance, for action? Why is it necessary?
I think because it allows us to make good decisions about what action we want to take, right? If you're, I think in sports, I think you could apply this to police officers too, is we use the expression playing within yourself, right? You don't want to try something that you can't do, right? You don't want to decide to do an action that's impossible for you. It's probably not going to work well. Sometimes you can push beyond your limits, but yeah, it allows for good decisions, right? You're going to take opportunities that, as Gibson would say, are afforded, right? Can I jump across that huge puddle right in front of me? It depends on how far I can jump and how long my legs are. If I'm well calibrated to my own capabilities, then I'm going to make a good decision. I'm not going to jump and be halfway in the air and fall in the puddle and hurt myself, right? Yeah,
Right.
so that's the idea. Why we want to perceive it. It allows us to kind of select and control the actions appropriately that we want to do.
Okay. And you mentioned on in your book, I think it was page 66, you began this idea that and you kind of mentioned it a little bit already with the baseball example, but you said performers see pass-through ability, tackle ability, hit ability. And so if I understand this point that you're talking about, that the world, again, out there is not valueless. It is itself rich with ecological meaning that's perceived in terms of what opportunities it affords the person to do with it. So first of all, is that correct? And second, Can you expand on that?
Yeah. That's the That's Gibson's idea of affordances again. The world is inviting opportunities, both, and it should point out both good and bad, right? There's also negative affordances, right? I could fall here. I think we've talked about previously in previous. There's a net opportunity for an being ambushed if I go around that corner, right? Yeah. So the world is kind of inviting through the information it conveys. It's inviting opportunities for different actions. That we and I really like the invitation concept because it means I can accept them or not if I want. I don't have to take an invitation if I don't want to.
Okay. So, Rob, last week in the news, and I don't know if you would have read it or not, but a police officer was killed trying to deploy a spike belt. So there was a pursuit, a speeding vehicle. Officer got up ahead of the pursuit, took the spike belt out of his vehicle, went to the roadway, and perceived that he had enough time to be able to deploy the spike belt, but the vehicle was traveling at such a speed there just wasn't enough time to do it. And the sad thing, even more sad than this officer being struck and killed by the vehicle, is every year we have officers who are killed on attempting to deploy spike belts. And so what I'm wondering is that there's an ecological world. It's rapidly changing. There's a vehicle quickly coming. The officer's determining that he or she has the affordance to be able to deploy the spike belt, but there's a huge decision error. So why do those types of things happen, and how is the training environment related to maybe those errors occurring?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's a really I'll start out with it. That's an incredibly difficult judgment to make, right? That you're the other thing we find, sometimes this ability to kind of perceive this affordance is also affected by pressure, and kind of sometimes we don't perceive it as well when we're under high pressure. Kind of have to, so I think part of it is training, with some kind of a pressure in that situation, time pressure, or you have to get this done. It's probably it's not something probably that's very well calibrated, like knowing how long it actually takes. I think people underestimate sometimes how long it takes to do certain actions like that. So but I think that's incredibly it's the same reason why, not to minimize it, but the way baseball batters strike out, where they're highly trained in practice, but it's just such a fine judgment that you can make mistakes in those situations. But I think practicing it under some sort of pressure where you have to get it done in a certain amount of time, and then, just learning how long that actually takes to do.
Right. And I wonder if, so let's say, for example, just hypothetically, if an officer's spike belt training was always done in a linear environment where those constraints weren't there and the pressure wasn't there, then would it be surprising to see that there's decision errors then that are being made in that ecological nonlinear environment if there's been no exposure to that in the training environment?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think, the research, there's some good research from people in the Netherlands on shooting decisions, and shooting skill when under no pressure, typical gun range versus pressure situation where someone's shooting soap pellets back at you. And they found quite a large difference initially, right? And people's kind of ability to handle those situations and things. Yeah. So I think that, it's a simplistic explanation. There's also obviously judging the kind of how long you have for a car that's going way faster than the normal speed limit's difficult as well to kind of perceive that opportunity as well. So I think there's a lot of factors there that obviously make it a really difficult action to perform.
Right. And so that would speak then to the importance of contextual relevance and variability in training.
Mm-hmm.
So the first time an officer is exposed to a vehicle coming 90 miles an hour towards them down the highway is not the first time they're trying to deploy the spike belt in that context. Sure. And I think trainers then, if they embrace this ecological dynamic approach, need to find ways to do it safely, but to put officers in context where they can perceive those things and and make those decisions. So you've said that every performer sees different affordances for actions depending upon their perceived capability. So far so good. And you gave the baseball example. So yeah, I mean, if I'm facing a 95 mile an hour pitch, there's no hit ability for this guy at all. So
yeah, I've tried it. Same here. Yeah. I mean, not get killed not get hurt by the ball is my one of the main affordance I'm interested in. Yeah.
Right. So with that, then you speak about this idea of body and action capacity scaling. So can you tell us what is that, and why is it an important concept for performers and coaches?
Yeah, it's kind of it's related to this. It's this learning this relationship between what your abilities and your body dimensions and the environment, right? So, how big of a thing can I jump over? Can I climb this? Can I reach that on the shelf without going to get a step stool? Right. That's kind of a simple scaling. Knowing how high you can reach is, obviously depends on your own. And through experience, this shows we're pretty well. The scaling is quite good. Most people scale it to their body quite well. And obviously they're different scaling for different people. But it can only really come through experience, right? You have to try grabbing things off the shelf, different shelf heights, and knowing what you can and can reach. But people are usually pretty good after, getting some experience of doing this kind of scaling.
So would body and action scaling then, would it be, so say, as an officer with all their tools on their belt, their baton, their taser, all of that, so their ability to interact with all that equipment and the speed with which they can do it, the efficiency with which they can do it, would that be an example of how body and action scaling would help inform them of what affordances might or might not be available?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Chris. I think that equipment is going to change their capacities, right? Their both the space they take up, but their ability to move. I had I've had an interview a few weeks ago with Greg Souders, who does the new jiu-jitsu, and like he talks about in his gym, they do most of their training without a gi, right? Because wearing a jacket in martial arts creates a new affordance, right? Opportunity to take someone down by grabbing their jacket that's not there when someone's just wearing a t-shirt or something. So yeah, those kind of change the affordance for sure. As a sporting example, I'm a big one on is a lot of the football practice we do is without helmets, right? Wearing a football helmet is heavy. It changes your visibility, right? So it changes what the information you're getting, what's afforded. So I think it's important to practice at least some of the time in with all that on and getting used to calibrating for that.
Right. Good. Oh, that's excellent. And so you discussed an interesting study. I was fascinated by this, being a rock climber, mountain climber myself, and in your book that was done, and they explored the capacity of rock climbers to shape the way they perceive opportunities for action when they're climbing a rock face. So can you maybe discuss a little bit about that study and what the findings were, and how do they apply to what we're talking about?
Yeah, so what they did was they started with, they measured basically hand strength. So they had an apparatus you got to squeeze, right? And as tight as you can, and how much force you can generate with your fingers and your hands. And obviously more skilled rock climbers have higher capacity, right? They have stronger hands in general. And then they had them look and plot a route on a rock wall. So they had with various different holds, ones that were smaller, which require much more strength in your fingers to be able to hold. And basically they found that there was a direct relationship. So people that had kind of lower hand strength and grip strength just chose kind of this basic path up the rock face, whereas people with more capacity they explored much more options. So increasing this capacity increases the invitations of different routes you're getting. So this is one of the things that where I like to try to connect, kind of strength and conditioning with a sports skill, with its particular skill, right? Doing stuff to increase my hand strength is going to give me the potential to get more affordances and invitations I can take from my environment.
And I think a related topic to that, or aspect of that, would be in law enforcement. So shooting a handgun, for example, I read a study recently that they looked at grip strength in an officer's, really their affordance, their ability to draw their weapon and use it quickly, as well as their shot accuracy and then their subsequent cadence on the trigger. And they found that officers with greater grip strength were better across all measures that they looked at, better in that they had better performance. So I think that, the biomechanical aspect of it directly relates to this. So you mentioned that embodied perception supports action selection. So, and I think maybe you've touched on this a little bit, but maybe do you want to expand on that as to how embodied perception supports action selection?
Yeah, so action selection, I'm talking about here about decision making. Do I try to reach that? Do I try to run after that person? Do I try to subdue them? What do I decide to do in a situation? The fact that I'm perceiving the world in terms of what I can do, my capacities, allows for that. It allows, helps me make the kind of the best decision, the one that's most likely going to be successful out of those options. If I'm perceiving these opportunities relative to what I can do in my capacity, my body dimensions.
And so that decision making, Rob, it's going to be different for every performer then, isn't it? Depending upon how they view their own capability. And where I'm getting at in this is, I recently was on the road. I was staying in a hotel and I got in the elevator on the main lobby and pushed the close button. And as the elevator doors were closing, I see this guy who starts running for the elevator, and he's got his two pieces of luggage, one in each hand, and he starts running and he does this amazing, just before the doors close, he twists his body and manages to hop into the elevator. I congratulated him. I said, well, that was amazing. I said, I would have been a mess if I would have tried that. And so he saw really it was pass-through ability in that. But what struck me is there was like no technique, right? I mean, nobody ever trained him in how to organize himself quickly to make that decision, to make that move. So is that what you're looking at here, where you're talking about, every day, how we act in ways like that, how we interact with our environment?
Yeah, for sure. And, we kind of, and I think, kids are the ultimate, like on playgrounds, they perceive I can jump from this swing set to that thing, like, which is not at all what was designed for, right? They perceive these opportunities, fun opportunities, things and yeah, for sure. I think that's a large part of what we do.
And so with that in mind, then, like, I guess the takeaway from this would be that every officer in a situation, in a combative situation, let's say, is going to perceive the solutions for action differently based upon really two critical factors. One is what are they extracting from the environment, and how does that relate to their own embodied perception or of their own ability to respond to that? Because one officer may make an excellent decision and decide they don't have the capacity, so they disengage and get more distance, versus another officer who has a different perception of their affordances or their capabilities there and stays and chooses control techniques in order to deal with that. But it doesn't mean that one is right and one is wrong, does it?
No, I don't think so. I think, like we said, being appropriately calibrated for what you do, what you can do, is what we really want. We tend to, glorify pushing our limits and and I guess there's space for that, going beyond what we pushing it. But I think overall, we're going to be more successful if we kind of, and then work on, if there's something we see that we could have done and we didn't, then go work on that, and training and strength training and whatever else. But I think overall in the actual field and in the game, we want people making the right decisions. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. So now let's get into chapter 6 here. And I love I loved your title in chapter 6 of the whole book. This title just really floored me. Um, Chapter 6 is titled "Learning as Search: The Laws of Attraction and the Tim Tebow Problem," and we'll get into Tim Tebow and why the amazing Tim Tebow had a problem in your opinion. But so you begin this chapter, Rob, by reminding us that there's no such thing as an ideal technique. You remind us about the myth of repeatability of exact movement solutions, that it doesn't exist, and that variability rules the day. And so I want to start this with that conversation, because if that's true, that variability rules the day, and I agree with your contention that it does. However, you immediately introduce this concept of invariance. So we have variability rules of the day, and now we're going to talk about invariance, which to me at first almost appeared to be contradictory to the importance of variability, but it's not. So how can you help us understand that?
Yeah, so there's a phrase that I like to use that I call it conditions, not positions. I know that almost rhymes. The idea that to be successful, yes, we could literally shoot a gun anyway. We could shoot a gun under our leg, over our head, sideways, one hand, two hands. But to actually be successful and accurate, there's some conditions we have to meet, right? You can't just do anything. So not completely everything goes, even though there's lots of opportunities. You have to stabilize, right? Somehow you have to control with the force of pulling the trigger. So there's some kind of conditions that could be met, that have to be met. Those are kind of the invariant properties, the things that are. So if you look at across performers that are all very skilled, you tend to see there's some things in common, even though they're, the example, like if you look at tennis players, you look at, Roger Federer versus Nadal versus there's some things in common, even though they don't do exactly the same thing. Kind of the things in common are what I mean by invariance, kind of the things you need to have in order to be successful.
Okay, so those would be then basically the core, the critical biomechanical movements of a particular technique. So in a let's take a combative situation where an officer is trying to do, say, a takedown. There are invariant principles inherent in how to do an effective takedown.
Yeah.
But the actual techniques that every performer might use to apply those invariant principles could look differently in every situation.
The specifics, yeah, for sure.
Perfect. Good. Okay. I think that's helpful. So now I'm just going to read one more short paragraph from your book. This is on page 80, and you're introducing this idea of intrinsic dynamics. And so you say, so what we are seeing here is that even though in theory there are endless number of movement solutions that we could use, we all have certain coordination tendencies. We are attracted to certain solutions that are highly stable and struggle to execute others that are very unstable. And we call these tendencies your intrinsic dynamics, referring to the motion of our body. There are attractors and intrinsic dynamics for every skill we perform. So, okay, talk to us about intrinsic dynamics and attractors. What are they, and how do they relate to these concepts we're talking about?
Yeah, I think it's a fancy term for for what we intrinsic meaning, coming from within, dynamics, kind of movement. I think we just have, all of us both kind of based on our physical, body, how we, our physical capabilities, both also how we learned. We kind of have these, preferred ways to coordinate our body, right? And I see this all the time in the sport mates where I work in baseball. Some pitchers prefer to throw the ball straight overhead, some more sidearm, some really low down, right? They just have these, and then trying to force them to do something else just because it's the typical way, is really, really counterproductive, right? They just, for whatever reason, they've developed kind of this pattern that they prefer, the way they prefer to move. I think it's a complicated combination of both, their body and how their earlier experiences in the sport.
Okay, and so as a personal example of that, so I ski a lot. I've skied since I was 12 years old, and
Mm-hmm.
that's a long, long time ago. But 2 years ago, I destroyed one of my knees skiing and had to have reconstructive surgery. And this is my first winter back on skis again. And what I noticed is that the my embodied cognition and my perceived capability is now entirely different. And it's not something I consciously have done, but what I started paying attention to, Rob, is now that I'm skiing, is all these, so these intrinsic dynamics of how my body actually moves now is being completely recalibrated because of my, those intrinsic capabilities. And so would that be an example of intrinsic dynamics and how that changes?
Yeah, I think it's the same kind of general idea. Usually, I think intrinsic dynamics is more something kind of longer term than injury, but I think it's the same idea, right? Your coordination patterns, how your body wants to move, definitely changes after injury. That's why, one of my side things later in the book, I don't like the term injury rehabilitation. It means like getting back to what you used to do when you skied. I think it's counterproductive, right? You have a new body, right? You have new constraints, you're right, new dynamics your body prefers. So you have to kind of work with that. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? We can learn to do anything, but forcing it back to the way it used to be, which is a lot of what we do in rehab and physio is kind of, I think, is counterproductive.
Right. And so I'm
Yeah.
thinking then of, okay, so officers in use of force training, they are going to have, so the way that they move, their natural sort of intrinsic dynamics about how they've developed patterns of movement, how they
Mm-hmm.
move biomechanically is going to be, there's a lot of variability in that. So would then coaches or trainers, would they be well advised to appreciate? So this goes back to not replicating some myth of a single technique, or
Mm-hmm.
worse, I think what trainers do sometimes is they lay over the trainees because of how I move. So how I would move to solve that problem, I lay my intrinsic dynamics over
Mm-hmm.
how this person should move. And I think when we do that, we're trying to force something that's entirely contrary to their own students' own intrinsic natural movement pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And do and is so A, that's a problem, right? And B, if we do that, are we likely to increase a chance of injury because we're talking about rapid movement, ballistic motor movements, and now we're trying to encourage a movement that is not conducive to this person's normal movement pattern?
Yeah, so yeah, I think I do think overall trying to force something on a person that is against kind of how they naturally want to move can be dangerous. Although, there are cases where you recognize that the way that they're doing it is not going to be effective and might cause injury itself. So I have lots of cases where the people I work with, people, their natural kind of tendencies gets them injured all the time, right? So I have to try to get them to do something different. In that case, I think it depends on how you do it and why you do it. Are you doing it just because you don't like the way it looks and it's not the way you do it? You're right. That's not a good reason, right? But if it's a way that can make them more effective and then possibly less chance of injury, then I do think it's worth trying.
Right. Okay. Excellent. So, then you state here that there are two reasons why these attractors for coordination exist. And the first reason that you state is that they make us resist perturbations. Have I even
Yeah.
pronounced that right?
Yeah. Yeah. So perturbations are kind of like disturbances. When we're running, you think about when you're running, all the things that happen, like changes, the ground slopes changing, there's little pebbles, there's frictions changing, it's slippery. Your body automatically adjusts to almost all of those, right? Unless it's a really, really big thing and you trip or something. But so those little changes, perturbations in the environment, we're really quick to adjust to because our bodies kind of put this a running gait is like a really a good example of an attractor. Like people are pulled towards a certain pattern and timing of their stepping. If you get knocked out of it by stepping in a little hole, your body kind of pulls you right back in, because that's a really strong attractor for the movement.
Okay. And so then those intrinsic dynamics help us to resist the perturbations that are in our environment. So an example again for law enforcement would be, say, if I'm in somebody's kitchen at a domestic and I end up in a fight and the footing is variable, it changes from linoleum to carpet and there's chairs and tables and I hit and so there's perturbations all over the place there. So my body's ability to rapidly adjust to those, would that be an application of those intrinsic?
Yeah, we've kind of developed attractors, your body's can stabilize, because attractors are kind of stable states, right? Your body's kind of pulling you into this. It wants to keep this state. So yeah, it'll kind of, if you've developed that, that's a good example. Yes, for sure.
Great. And then the second reason, Rob, that you provide that attractors for coordination exist is that they help us prevent injury and allow us to deal with extreme time pressure required for performance. So this is extremely applicable for law enforcement trainers because we're training our officers to be able to have what we call adaptive decision making in novel situations on the street. And so in order for them to be successful in that, and they're operating under extreme time pressures often where, and let's face it, consequences are immense for failure. So how would attractors help with performance in those high pressure, time compressed environments?
Yeah, basically, the idea is, we don't have enough. If something happened, like the example I give in the book is, in basketball, you jump up for a rebound, you come down and there's a person's foot underneath you, you land on it. The time it would take for your foot to sense that the ground's uneven now, the thing get motor sensations to go up to your brain, you figure out a plan, go back down and adjust, that's way too slow. Your ankle would be broken, right? You need to have much quicker kind of, this is your body's essentially self-organizing, it's adjusting to keep kind of that stability of that attractor, even though they've created this kind of dangerous situation. So yeah, these stable states help us kind of make really quick and rapid adjustments and reorganization to keep our body from getting injured. They don't always work, obviously. People sprain their ankle all the time, but it gives us a better chance of doing it.
Well, and that really is all we can hope for at the end of the day as coaches and trainers is to ensure that we've given our students those opportunities. So that leads me to this question then. So are there some basic principles that you can help us understand as trainers, that as we design the training environment or the coaching environment, so if we want to have great decision makers under time compressed situations, their ability to resist perturbations in the environment, what should our training environment then, what principles should we adopt in our training environment?
Yeah, I think, there's a few different ones, that I think I've talked about. This is actually previewing my second book, but kind of overload, give a really quick time pressure, give more weight, create instability, right? You have to adjust it. I'm a big fan of using the kind of aqua bags, water bags, and kind of create the water, bag with the water sloshing around, create some instability, variability in the conditions, right? All these are kind of creating situations for change, right? Your body's kind of has to adapt to them. Just like you do in the weight room, like there's some kind of principle overload, right? You add extra weight and you kind of actually damage your muscles, right? And your body responds accordingly because it doesn't want that to happen again. And so I think those are some of the ideas. Yeah. But I do definitely, I get into more of that in the training action capacities in the other book. Yeah.
Oh, great. Well, we'll look forward to that podcast when we get there. Yeah. So Rob, just when I thought I had a good understanding, okay, I understand what these attractors are and why they're so important, you then introduced this, or you mentioned this idea of breaking free from attractors. And I thought, why in the world would I want a student of mine to break free from attractors? Like, I thought these were a good thing.
Yeah.
And so help us understand, like, is there some dark side to attractors that we need to be aware of?
Yeah, it is kind of the basic idea is that yeah, they have all these advantages, but there's some kind of things that, especially if we learn them and we develop in environments that are kind of restricted and don't kind of push us, we can learn these kind of stable patterns that when we go try to in a more difficult and challenging environment, they're not going to work anymore. The example I gave it for myself is I learned how to swim in a lake as a kid, right? So all I cared about was getting from that raft to the dock. So when I did a front crawl, I had no idea that you need to blow the air out when you're underwater so that when you came up, you could take a breath and go back. There was no reason. I wasn't racing anybody. It worked perfectly fine. Then later in my life, I started doing triathlon, and where I cared about how fast I was going, how efficient. And that's the first thing the coach said. He's like, "Are you blowing it?" I'm like, "No, I had no idea." And so I had I had a bunch of that and a bunch of other kind of swimming tendencies and way I wanted to do it that were really ineffective, and I kind of had to relearn and break those attractors. And this is where Tim Tebow comes in as well, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's talk about Tim Tebow and the Tim Tebow problem, as you said. But before I let you talk about Tim Tebow, I just want our listeners to get a little bit of a background on Tim Tebow, because truly an amazing college athlete. And so in 2007, Tim Tebow was awarded the Heisman Trophy, and he was the first sophomore to win the Heisman Trophy. He finished the regular season as the only player in FBS history to rush and pass for at least 20 touchdowns in both categories in the same season. He had 32 passing touchdowns, 23 rushing touchdowns. At the end of his college career, Tim Tebow held 5 National Collegiate Athletic Association NCAA championships, 14 SEC championships, 28 University of Florida statistical records. He was the SEC's all-time leader in career efficiency. That's passing, touchdown, interception, rushing yards by a quarterback, and rushing touchdowns. So I could go on about Tim Tebow, but I just want, so here's an amazing athlete at the college level. And so tell us, Rob, why did you say the Tim Tebow problem?
Yeah, so this brings back in the concept, we talked about it, whether the idea of constraints, right? So every environment has different constraints in terms of what's required to be successful, right? So the basic problem, and there's a link to in the book. There's a good ESPN sports science episode. They analyze this and break it down. So it's not just me. So basically, Tim Tebow had a habit of holding the football really low when he dropped back in the pocket. And one thing is when you get tackled, you're more likely to fumble it that way because you don't. But more importantly, his delivery, once he decided to pass, it took a little bit longer to get the ball up and then release it, as opposed to you go watch like someone like Tom Brady. He holds it ball up by his chest the whole time, and he can get it out really a bit quicker. That time, that little bit of fraction of time, which is not very long, wasn't really critical in college football because the constraints, the time constraints in particular, were less, right? They weren't as demanding. I mean, the defensive linemen are not getting there as quickly, right? He has more time to get the ball out. When he gets to the NFL, when everybody, all the best defensive linemen from college are now on one team, right? They're getting there quicker, and so this attractor, this movement pattern he developed over years and years, wasn't effective anymore. And so that basic idea is that if you kind of train in an environment of certain constraints, you can develop, like, think about learning to kind of fight or martial arts against a person that's always shorter than you, right? You're going to learn a technique that will be really, really effective, that probably is not going to be good as soon as you fight someone taller, right? You couldn't get as close because they have longer reach, right? So the idea is if you really train in these kind of environments, you get these kind of habits that are really hard to break and really hard to get out of these attractors. That's the idea of Tim Tebow, right? So that he couldn't really, despite lots of practice and people knew, they couldn't really break out of this attractor of holding the ball low.
And that's what I wanted to reinforce is that they certainly tried multiple things to try to change his, I guess, his intrinsic dynamic or his attractor that he had developed, but were not able to do that because at that point they become so powerful. But so I want to relate this to law enforcement. So we often have a problem in our training is that the training environment is not very reflective of the reality of the what we call the criterion environment. And so let's take a shooting example so in shooting training, the officer may be afforded extended period of time to draw their weapon, to get their gun out, to deliver the shots. And while that might be appropriate, maybe very early on in training, but the problem we see is when that training now progresses for a long period of time, they develop attractors in that movement that now when they're in the criterion environment and the time compression is incredible and they need to respond more quickly, they're still responding at the speed of, we call the speed of qualification rather than the speed of a gunfight. Or an officer in combatives training who has a role player who comes with a right punch, but it's very slow and it's unrealistic in its biomechanics. And so they develop the ability because they read that repeatedly over and over in training, that they develop attractors to respond to that. But then when they have a punch that comes at them in 170 milliseconds on the street, those attractors fail horribly. And so with, like, I guess where I'm going with this is if we understand that if the training environment instills these attractors that are completely non-conducive to the criterion environment, that's a huge problem for our students to break once that's developed.
Yeah, for sure. It creates this really difficult situation, if we're into the concept of transfer, right? The strategy you're learning and technique you're learning and training is not going to work and transfer to the real environment. As human beings, we're like really efficient learners. If you give me a shortcut, I'm going to take it, right? Yeah, it's one of the most difficult. I deal with this a lot, in my consulting teams I work with. And one of the hardest parts is it's really hard to break that. One of the things you'll find if you try to do this in practice, and I'm sure they saw this with Tim Tebow, they can make them change, hold the ball high in practice by doing coaching and drills. As soon as they get back in the game, though, it's hard to make it really stick. You kind of, as soon as you're in the environment again, you get pulled back into this kind of more comfortable, habitual way of moving. So yeah, it can be really dangerous to develop really strong attractors for ineffective movement patterns.
Right. And so there's a huge responsibility then on law enforcement trainers to be aware of that so that our training environment does not create those artificial movement patterns that are not going to work in the criterion example. And so I think, and related to this, Rob, you talk about this idea of local minima, which really impacted me because I see this as a problem historically in my training years ago. I can see where I fell into this problem with local minima. So you mentioned well, first of all, tell us what is local minima.
Yeah, it's kind of this idea of, if all the possible solutions are this big landscape of movements I could do, a local minimum is one that, okay, relative to the ones around me, it works pretty well. It's kind of like, good is the enemy of great kind of idea, right? This works right now for what I have, so I don't really have incentive to try something else, right? I often see this, with, in baseball, for example, if I don't really have the conditions that require me to pitch the ball really hard, I can use mostly just my upper body. I really don't have to learn how to rotate my hip, do all that. There's no real incentive. It's just easier, right? This is kind of a local, a solution that works right now, and it's better than the kind of any other ones. But once I want to go to a more difficult constraints where I have to throw the ball much harder, that's not going to work and be effective anymore. So I get pulled in kind of by being good, good enough for the conditions I'm training in, practicing in. Like you said, the qualifying. I've learned a solution just good enough for that way, because I'm really not incentive. Why would I go find something better? I don't need to. I'm making everybody happy right now.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. And
Yeah.
as I reflect back on my law enforcement training, I mean, I saw this everywhere. I didn't know what it was called, but local minima. But for example, in striking, where generation of power, let's say in an elbow strike, requires a lot of horizontal ground reaction force, rapid hip rotation, torso rotation to deliver high energy elbow strikes. But students would quickly degenerate into a local minima of what's the minimum amount of movement that I can make and still make my elbow hit the target. And you just knew that they were just instilling a terrible practice that was not going to be successful operationally. So would that be an example of how we just automatically seem to want to default to that local minima movement?
Yeah, I think, like I said, we're, some could say lazy learners, but I like to say efficient. Right? We're not gonna overdo it, right? If we don't need to. And part of that is like a good thing, right? If you're gonna make me fight in really easy conditions all the time where my opponent's slow, it'd be a waste of my energy and resources to come out with a really complicated strategy, right? I'm really kind of optimizing for this lesser conditions, but then when I get in the other situation, I'm going to struggle. Yeah.
Okay, so you make this statement, Rob. You say effective coaching involves making sure that the constraints our performers face forces them out of this local minima attraction problem and makes them explore the perceptual motor landscape. So, can you expand on this for us? What do you mean by exploring the perceptual motor landscape?
Yeah. So this is kind of getting into the constraints that approach. So creating conditions where these kind of shortcuts and local quick solutions aren't going to work anymore. Making people have to hit with higher force or stronger opponent, or you're right with your blocking example, someone that punches much harder from different angles. You're creating these situations where that it's not going to be not going to be a minima anymore. It's not going to work, right? I gotta go find something else to do because what I was doing before doesn't work in these new conditions.
Okay, the new conditions. And so would
Yeah.
you say then that this idea of making sure, like introducing variability in training, does that force your student then to continually explore that perceptual motor landscape and find solutions?
Yeah, for sure. And the simple example I always like to use is a kid crossing the street, right? While you step on the side of the street and you see a car that's 200 feet away, is it safe to cross? Maybe, right? This distance is not a good solution to use, right? Depends on how fast it's going. And hopefully if you get in an environment with cars going different speed, I force you to come up with something different, like a time-based strategy. So yeah, that's the idea. That's where I think coaches being really creative and thinking, what can I add to practice that this doesn't work anymore? That's really the crux of the constraints that approach. Kind of pushing them away and not telling them what you want them to do differently necessarily, but pushing them away from this simple solution they've come up with.
And forcing them to explore.
Yeah.
In really a band of, I've also heard like Robert Bjork talks about desirable difficulties and the importance of error in learning and problem solving. And really that's a critical concept is putting him in that variability that forces.
Yeah, that's a great point, Chris. I think we talked that if you add that constraint, they're probably going to fail, right? At first, because they're old. They should if you designed it well, right? Their old solution doesn't work anymore. So it's important kind of to set the stage for that and say, that can emphasize that's how we get better, right? When, what we're doing doesn't work anymore, we find something even better.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Dr. Gray, one last concept I want to talk to you about before we conclude the interview. You mentioned And I'm glad you did in chapter 6, this idea of the 10,000 rule. And this is a question that I constantly get from trainers about how many repetitions does it take to make somebody proficient at something. And we seem to get hung up on this idea of the number of repetitions, and this 10,000 rule that was popularized by, as you say, Erickson in his research on deliberate practice, and then unfortunately was further picked up and propagated by Gladwell in his book Outliers. But this is a concept that's very common. And so can you talk to us about this and why this concept of needing 10,000 hours or 10,000 repetitions to develop skill performance is problematic?
Yeah, so this idea, so the idea of Erickson's idea was this idea of deliberate practice, which I think is what we should take from it in the end. Is the fundamental idea is you get better by working on stuff you're not already good at, right? You're deliberate in your practice. You don't just go out and do a whole bunch of golf swings on a driving range. You are deliberate about what you want to work on because you want to get better. That's what Erickson studied. He measured how much people did of that, how much of that kind of practice, not just going at scrimmaging, playing with your friends, focusing on stuff that's not always very fun, right? Because you're not very good at it. And on average, he looked at across it, he found this in music, chess players, sports. On average, he found that people did 10,000 hours. That's where but it's an average, right? It doesn't apply to everybody. But so the idea is you have to do that. Most people that are really elite in something started young, right? You fairly young. You can't pick up. Most people can't start playing golf when they're 30 and expect to make the PGA Tour, right? It can happen. It's not very likely because you don't have enough time to build up that kind of deliberate practice. But so any kind of number, I don't think there's any magical number, but I think the core idea of focusing on being deliberate, why am I out here on this today? What am I working on? What's this purpose of this practice drill? And that's really his kind of enduring legacy, which I think is really, really smart.
Right. And
yeah.
So a law enforcement trainer, say in the academy, Rob, that gets a recruit or a cadet in the academy for, say, 6 months, where these students, they're not elite, they've not practiced since they were young. Many of them have very little sports background anymore. And so the academy is faced with trying to take a civilian and make them a successful performer. Like elite is not even part of our equation. It's just, can we make them good decision makers and good performers in those 6 months? And so I think traditionally the way we've answered that is this myth of, well, so we've done a linear based sort of training method because we've been seduced by the illusion of learning that when we see this improvement in training over 6 months, we think, oh, look at how good they are performing now. And then we see an incredible decrement in performance operationally and a lack of transfer, as you've mentioned. And so I think this really speaks to the importance of the ecological dynamic nonlinear training environment, because you talk about the acceleration of skill acquisition. Well, if there's anything that's incredibly important for law enforcement trainers, I've got 6 months to accelerate skill acquisition in my students. So can you just help, like give us some concepts based on the first 6 chapters of your book? So what would be takeaways that you would encourage trainers to?
Yeah, I think, one of the fundamental ones is, challenging people at the right level and kind of scaling the test. So, if you wanted to teach someone shooting, right, focus on the performance outcomes. You put a target 20 feet away and if someone misses them all, right, you need to make the task easier. You need to focus maybe on constraints about technique. Someone hits them all, then you can move the target out, make it smaller, right? So kind of individualizing it and challenging, rather, there's not some magic number that's going to work for everybody. Doing 500 shots at this distance is going to be a good challenge for some people, too easy for others, right? We want to kind of build, I know that's harder way to coach than just giving everybody the same thing, but kind of challenging people, variability, and kind of focusing on the kind of success and outcomes rather than the number of trials or number of repeats, right? That's going to be very different for individuals on what number is going to work for them.
Okay. And so if we have them focus on those goals and principles of performance rather than internally focused on biomechanics and movement, that would be preferable for their learning.
The other way, what I like to do, instead of spending these hours and hours and hours on technique and mechanics and then letting them actually do the skill, I'd much rather let them try. And then, if you see something as an instructor they need to work on, then add constraints, add cues, rather than focusing so much out of context, decomposed, where you're not actually, interacting with the environment. That's, that's the way that I prefer to do it.
Fantastic. Well, Rob, we've been at this for an hour now, so let's bring it to a conclusion. But is there anything else that you'd like to say in summary before we end chapter 5 and 6 of your book?
No, I don't think so. I think there's some stuff gonna connect with it in the next one. So
yes,
we can leave it for then. Yep.
Excellent. Okay. Well, Dr. Gray, thanks again for your time, and
my pleasure.
Look forward to you on the next podcast, sir.
Okay. Sounds good.
Well, we hope that you've enjoyed this episode of the Trainer's Bullpen. And as always, our encouragement to you is that you would reflect deeply about the critical aspects of this interview and how you can apply the principles that you heard to advance your training and make your students more effective and adaptive performers in the real world. As a reminder, all of the research papers, as well as the other links, are available to you over at the Trainer's Bullpen website at trainersbullpen.com. Thank you for your dedication to advancing officer and public safety.